Okay.
Welcome to What's for Lunch, conversation about trends and trade in food and ag and how they affect what's on your plate. This series is designed to examine current issues from a variety of perspectives, sometimes controversial and sometimes not, but always with a unique perspective, always interesting and always lively. I'm Susan Burns, your lunchtime host, and thrilled to be here. Special thanks to our distinguished panelists, who I will introduce to you in more detail in just a moment. The format is that each person will speak for between 10 to 20 minutes, and then we'll do a roundtable and also take questions. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat bar. Today we're going to talk about how NAFTA has disrupted the Mexican agricultural system, their food and health, how it's linked to the obesity epidemic, diabetes, and other health issues, how food information is conveyed to consumer. We're going to talk about food policy. Does the elimination of trade and investment barriers bring a moral imperative on to the companies that benefit? And do consumers have a right to healthy food under current international treaties and protocols? Our speakers today, as you saw, Alyshia Galvez, Michael Roberts, and Daria Kortova will be speaking in that order. Alyshia Galvez is with Lehman College at the City University of New York, and she is also an author. She's a cultural and medical anthropologist, as well as being a professor. Her most recent book is titled Eating NAFTA, Trade, Food Policies, and the Destruction of Mexico. The book is about changing food policies, systems, and practices in Mexico and Mexican communities in the United States. And this includes how they're impacted by trade and economic policy and what the public health implications are. She was the founding director of the Jaime Lucera Mexican Studies Institute at CUNY, and she's the author of two previous books on Mexican migration, one of which won the 2012 ALLA Book Award from the Association of Latino and Latin American Anthropologists. So we're thrilled to have Alyshia with us today. Also, I put the last name wrong here. This is Michael Roberts, not Michael Baum. Michael Baum was in our last session, but Michael Roberts is the executive director of the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law. Michael is very experienced and well-versed in a broad range of legal and policy issues, from farm to fork in local, national, and global food supply systems. He authored the first major treatise on food law in the United States, and he also is a co-editor of Food Law and Policy, which is a relatively new case book that was published just last year. He's also written several other articles, and he's a contributing author on many other topics as well. Michael's particular interest is in how the conveyance of information to consumers about food is regulated, and then the intersection between public health and food regulation, and the history and development of food law. I had the opportunity to hear Michael speak and present some of his ideas when I was at the University of Arkansas working on my LLM in food and agricultural law, and I can tell you firsthand that we are also very thrilled to have Michael Roberts with us today. He's an excellent speaker and a font of information. And last, but certainly not least, is Daria Kortova. She's an attorney and professor at HSE Skolkovo Institute for Law and Development in Moscow. She's a recent graduate of the University of Arkansas, and Daria also has an LLM in ag and food law. While Daria was at the University of Arkansas, she was a graduate assistant for Professor Uche Ewalukwa, And she did a lot of academic research on food justice, food sovereignty, and the right to food in developing countries. She recently moved back to Moscow after obtaining her degree and began working in the HSE Institute. She focuses on agricultural trade and pharmaceuticals, and she's also a member of the faculty, and she does research in bioethics and ethical issues in law. So we're also happy to have Daria, and you can see I use the same slides from last time. I did not change the name, but she's stepping into some big shoes, and she did work for Uche. So there we have it. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Alyshia Galvez.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Susan, for the invitation. Hopefully I can control the images.
Just one second here. I'm switching over.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm pleased today to talk about my research that culminated in the book Eating NAFTA, Trade and Food Policies and the Destruction of Mexico, which is out on UC Press. And in the book, I focus on the ways that that NAFTA has impacted the food system in North America, with a particular focus on Mexico and the public health crisis that has emerged in the last 2 decades in Mexico, culminating in a very large-scale federal government response to address the epidemic of diabetes and diet-related illness, as well as obesity. So today I thought I would talk a little bit about what NAFTA was intended to do, what the idea was of NAFTA, and what it actually looks like on the ground. As a cultural anthropologist, I'm interested in the ways that policy impacts everyday lives and how people who may not be consulted or at the negotiating table see their lives transformed in ways that oftentimes are not visible, are not discussed in civil society. With NAFTA, there has been a large-scale shift in many aspects of life. We know that it impacts trade and labor, and we know it impacts a lot of the talk in the United States centers on manufacturing, on the car industry, on electronics, on air conditioners. But what we don't hear as much about is the way that free trade policy actually gets into our bodies and onto our plates. And so I thought I would talk about that today. I think your audience is familiar with the North American Free Trade Agreement, but just to review, it went into effect in 1994, and it links the 3 economies of North America. It was revised and signed just before the new president took office in Mexico, on the last day of the prior president's administration, and has been rebranded by President Trump as the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement. But the revised agreement still has to be approved by the US Congress. So it's not a done deal as much as the performance of the signing ceremony implied that. So when NAFTA was conceptualized, the idea of it that was marketed to the Mexican people and that was shared somewhat between the 3 countries was the idea of liberating the flow of capital, people, and goods in the region. So the notion that barriers would be taken down that inhibit the flow of capital, people, and goods in the region. And so for Mexico, this was an important 3-legged stool. And as we know, a 3-legged stool is stable, and a 2-legged stool not so much. Unfortunately, the reality very quickly became dominated by the United States, that included capital and goods. People were left off of the table. Mexico was told that was a non-starter before the negotiations began. And so the deal has, centered in its initial negotiating phase of negotiation on capital and goods, without really an understanding of what would happen, what the human impact of the deal would be, and what kinds of displacements might occur. I would like to mention that the Mexican negotiators and the Mexican government did anticipate displacement from the countryside as a result of NAFTA. And there was an understanding that as many as 500,000 people could be displaced from the countryside of Mexico as a consequence of the trade agreement. As we can see in the next slide, that was a gross underestimation. And in fact, after NAFTA, we see the largest wave of migration from Mexico to the United States in history, peaking before the financial crisis and then declining since the financial crisis still today. But we saw as many as 500,000 people per year being displaced from the countryside. And there was a dramatic reconfiguration of the way that where people live, but also the way that they live in Mexico. A lot of the estimates put the flow of Mexican nationals to the United States between 1995 and 2008 as high as 10 million, which would mean 1 in 10 Mexicans displaced by NAFTA. The other big effect of NAFTA has been chronic disease. And so I want to just show a couple of images that demonstrate some of the health consequences of the North American Free Trade Agreement. So if we see in 2005, we see that around the world there's a rise in chronic disease. We can see this. Sorry, this isn't the slide I had intended to put here, but we can see a rise in chronic disease around the world, and this is what is often referred to as by epidemiologists as the epidemiological transition, in which infectious diseases start to become less frequent causes of death, and chronic diseases overtake them. And we see this in Mexico. We see a shift, and this slide just shows us a single decade, beginning a decade after NAFTA till 2015. We can see the rise in diabetes, heart disease, up 40% for heart disease, 28% for diabetes, 40% for chronic kidney disease. We can see the declines in respiratory infections, infectious diseases, and shifts to place chronic disease, which were already in the top ranking causes of death, but become even more significant. This slide is a slide that shows us how it's one of the images that's produced by the Mexican Health Ministry in conjunction with the Mexican Economic Ministry to show the impact of the diabetes epidemic. So we see an average over the last 10 to 15 years, we see an average of 70,000 deaths per year to diabetes. When this slide was made, it was a little lower. It was 65 to 70. Now it's more closer to 70 to 75. And it's a rising prevalence of diabetes. A lot more children being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which used to be referred to as adult onset diabetes. We see the significant cost to the public purse of diabetes, and we can see that it's not very visible in this screen, but the mortality rates of diabetes do not discriminate between countryside and cities. They don't discriminate between the North and the South. So in Mexico, historically, the South is much lower per capita income than the North, which is associated with higher incomes, higher levels of industrialization. The cities tend to be wealthier than the countryside, but we see that diabetes is really prevalent across the Republic in both rural and urban communities, wealthy and poor. And it's taking a significant toll on the population in terms of human costs, but also in terms of public health costs. So the prior slide was an indication of some of the ways that that the Mexican government is framing this, and this led to the national strategy against obesity and diabetes, which is a multi-sectoral strategy launched in 2014 by then President Peña Nieto. And it seeks to tax, there's a soda tax, there's prohibitions on advertising of sugar-sweetened beverages and other snack foods during children's television programming within a certain distance from schools, et cetera. And so we see this sort of massive approach. Interestingly, the health minister actually did not support this campaign. It was the finance ministry that took the lead on it, and the health minister was somewhat compelled to join along. The health minister at the time had been a former had formerly worked for FunSalud, which is the foundation that's owned by Nestle. And so, as in the US, there are concerns from civil society and from academic analysts that there is a significant issue of conflict of interest in terms of regulators as well as decision makers and corporate interests. So this is an example of a non-governmental civil society action that's designed to raise awareness about diabetes and about the connection to soda, specifically Coca-Cola, specifically, as we can see in the font. But this is an example of a civil society organization that's working to try to connect the dots between the availability, the hyper availability and hyper affordability of sugar sweetened beverages and snack foods to the diabetes and obesity epidemics. These sorts of activities are happening in the civil society, but in the formal governmental response, we see no acknowledgement that the landscape, the food system, has been altered over the last quarter century, and that the choices that are available to people are much different from the way that they used to be. And so I'll talk more about that with the remainder of my time, but I just want to point out that I think it's very important to note that even though public health and other scholars have noted that personal choice plays a relatively small role in addressing large-scale epidemics like this one. In Mexico, this public health campaign has been largely centered on changing personal decision-making and personal behaviors, fostering exercise, promoting moderation of consumption, and a tax which is structural, but structural with the aim of influencing individual choices and decision making, as opposed to taking a broader look at how the larger economy is structured and what kinds of food availability is influencing choices at the population level. So I want to, let's see, I think, did I lose control of the screen? Okay. Can you advance my, okay. So this is an example of, I just want to paint a picture of how the food system has shifted since NAFTA. So this is just the webpage of a government affiliated agency, which is ConMexico, which is part of the economic ministry, and it's designed to promote the development of consumer goods, the availability of consumer goods in the Mexican market. And so we can see here sort of a vision of the idea of modern prosperity and development that is being promoted within the policy sphere, as far as characterized and really exemplified by NAFTA. So we see, the middle class, light-skinned, nuclear family moving through the supermarket together, right? So consumption is a family activity, and we see, the mom having to take a discerning look at the product label, because product diversity increases availability, but then also puts the onus on the individual consumer to navigate the food system. And so being healthy and being a responsible consumer involves one educating oneself and engaging as a responsible consumer in the market, making decisions for the entire family. So this is sort of the model. This image for me kind of exemplifies what NAFTA kind of looks like in terms of the policy decision making. And now I want to talk about what the food system, how the food system has changed by focusing on a small rural community outside of Tehuacan, which is Tehuacan is the historical ancestral birthplace of corn. Thousands of years ago, humans, pollinated, fertilized corn for the first time and enabled it to grow. The Mesoamerican creation myths are centered on corn, people being, made possible by corn, and corn being made possible by people. And here we see corn farmers in San Jose Miahuatlan, which is a Nahuatl-speaking indigenous community. Most of the members of this community have migrated. So to see a young man and his father is actually somewhat unusual. The young man is a little bit too young to have migrated, and the father is maybe a little bit has returned or didn't go. But a lot of men and women of working age are in Oregon, Las Vegas, and New York. And so we see them drying their corn. And the corn can be dried and used throughout the season. And corn is the center, it's the heart of the ancestral foodways in this community. Milpa-based cuisine, the milpa is the intercropping of corn, squash, and beans that provides the foundation of the diet of people in this region for thousands of years. And I argue in my book that the milpa-based cuisine wasn't dramatically altered even by Spanish arrival. There were a lot of additions of dairy and livestock, an increase in meat and wheat consumption, and lard, obviously, but we don't see the milpa-based cuisine being threatened to a significant degree until relatively recently. So this is my friend's mother in her outdoor kitchen making memelas, which are one of the many varieties, tortillas, memelas, tlacoyos, tamales. There are a countless variety of foods that have as their base the ground corn masa. These are the memelas after they've been prepared. They can be a base for any kind of topping, salsas, vegetables, meats, cheeses, eggs. And this is another way that corn is consumed. So this is the same kind of corn oftentimes as the corn that gets ground. It just depends how long it's left to mature on the stalk. So corn that's going to be ground for tortillas typically is left longer so that it dries out more on the stalk, and the sugars are different as opposed to the fresher, younger corn that might be eaten as elotes or esquipes. This is in contrast to U.S. corn, which is typically used for industrial purposes. The sweet corn that we eat in the summer is not the same variety as the corn that gets grown in most of 95% of the fields in Iowa and other states in the Midwest. So this is an example of where people in this region, one of the kinds of markets that people in this region would have typically gotten the bulk of their food. It's a farmer's market. You can see the investment on the part of the municipality to create this shelter from the elements for the market, which would be held a few days a week. Today, the market's 1 day a week, and you can see in this picture one vendor, but what you can't see is that most of the dome is actually empty, and there are as many DVD sellers as there are fruit and vegetable sellers. So we don't see the vibrant marketplace that might typically have been there. One of the fixtures in many small towns is the tienda, the rural small-scale tienda. Susan, I know I'm getting close to my time, so I'm going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
You're okay. You can take.
I'm okay. Okay.
Yeah. If you want 5 more minutes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I won't need more than that. Thank you. So this is Yolanda, who has a little tienda. She's a widow. This is something she says she does basically to keep herself busy, not because it's a very viable economic activity. She doesn't have anyone that she has to support, so she uses it mostly as an opportunity to socialize with her neighbors. But as you can see in the tienda, her signage and you can't see her refrigerator, the signage outside, the racks, everything is corporate sponsored. So Bimbo, Coca-Cola, Pepsi tend to provide all of the equipment that a small store owner might need. And then the products obviously are shelf stable, highly processed foods. We see, the milk is shelf stable and maybe not as unhealthy, but obviously these are exactly the kinds of things that are being blamed for a lot of the diet related illness. In fact, the only thing that we can see in the store that is fresh and not processed, not industrialized, not hyper processed, would be the tortillas. So we see a kilo of tortillas here that someone in her community produces with a tortilla machine, and then she has a cooler behind the counter full of hot, fresh tortillas that she sells to her neighbors until they run out. So, this is the same town. We can see the Coca-Cola truck is a ubiquitous presence. In fact, people told me that when this street was paved not so long ago, the first thing to come down the street was the Coca-Cola truck. And you can see 6 pesos, less than 50 cents for a half liter of Coca-Cola is actually a discount compared to what you would pay in Mexico City. And it's well known that Coca-Cola tends to discount soda in rural and indigenous communities to put it even more within the budget of low-income people. This is a tortilla factory, which is, I personally always get excited when I see tortilla factories because it's a sign that people are still eating tortillas. But this is one of these examples that shows us a point of transition. So we see, the Coca-Cola bottles or some of these may be generic soda bottles stacked up next to sacks of industrial dried corn. So this is Maseca, or another brand of hyper industrial corn that's used to make the fresh tortillas that someone like Yolanda might sell in her store. It's no longer the corn that is being ground fresh by farmers, but it's an industrial product. And just a month ago, there was a big scandal because most of this corn was, in fact, they did tests and most of the corn that they sampled, in fact, had GMO corn in the corn flour, residue of GMO corn. And GMO corn is not permitted in Mexico, so it's a sign that U.S. corn is now being eaten in the form of tamales and not just being used for the corn starches, corn syrups, and corn fillers that all of these industrial products are. So this is just another scene where we can see sort of a combination in terms of the food system and what the landscape looks like, what the availability. This is Mexico City. We can see, the old school homemade, obviously none of this is what we would perhaps call health foods, but we see the homemade tortilla chips and peanut brittle, and there's an advertisement for tlayudas, which are corn, fresh corn, flat sort of pizza-like base that gets loaded often with cactus paddles and salsas, aguas frescas, which are can be fruit juice based drinks, but then we also have dorilocos and Doritos and the industrial products. So we see this sort of combination. But what we see more and more in Mexico is the proliferation and ubiquity of OXXO and Walmart, of kind of these giant big box stores like Walmart, as well as the small convenience stores in which there would be absolutely nothing fresh, nothing that is not packaged and hyper industrialized. And these are increasingly a part of the landscape. So I'm going to wrap up there. I just wanted to note, that when these shifts occur, a lot of them are occurring because people are opting for convenience. They're opting for price. They don't have I just want to go back one more second. They don't have the same ability to eat in their traditional ways. And often, it's because people are making choices, quite willingly and quite by choice, but there are things that are gained and things that are lost by these shifts. And so this is an image by artist Carmen Lomas Garza, and it's in conjunction with the work of Luz Calvo and Catriona Rueda Esquivel, who are based in California. But the idea of cooking as an act of cultural assertion, as an act of cultural expression. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alyshia. That was a great kickoff for this whole setting the groundwork for this whole presentation. And here I'm just trying to share my keyboard with Michael Roberts, who is joining us next. Hang on one second. Michael, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Welcome. If you want to just do a brief overview while I'm getting your presentation up, that would be great.
Thank you. My presentation will be very different than Alyshia's. First, I don't have any pictures. I cannot compare to her wonderful illustrations, but it's intended to be a framework, to offer a framework for understanding the development of NAFTA. Now I'm trying to...
So I'm going to have to do that because you need to download something in order to be able to control. So I'll have to advance the slides for you. That's okay.
Okay, that's okay. Let's go to the next slide. So this short presentation is an attempt to frame the discussion around NAFTA. So we're taking perhaps a step back from Alyshia's presentation and asking ourselves the question, how did we get it? How did we get NAFTA? What does it mean and where do we go? So in order to do that, I want to offer up just a very brief refresher of the international food trade system, looking at disputes and then the movement towards regional bilateral free trade agreements, such as NAFTA, and then honing in on the unintended consequences of NAFTA and looking at NAFTA and other agreements like NAFTA in terms of policy implementation, and then asking ourselves the questions, what are the implications and what to do. And I have just a couple of ideas to share with respect to that last point as we move along. Next slide, please. So a lot of this framing or structuring I take from a treatise that I drafted or authored in 2016, published by Cambridge on food law in the United States, that has a separate chapter on food trade. I mention that because food trade is certainly a very important and a critical part of food law and food policy in every country. Trade is integral to the setting of food policy in many respects. Next slide. So just some real basics here. International agreements. These are legal instruments that create law for parties. There's a number of different agreements that relate to food. And it's important to remember that these affect the legal relationships between stakeholders. And the stakeholders are generally the countries that enter into these agreements. And important for purposes of this presentation today, the food consumed by consumers, as pointed out in Alyshia's presentation. It's always good to remind ourselves who has the power to enter into these trade agreements. In the case of the United States, Congress has the exclusive authority to regulate international trade. This is under the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause, and under this authority, Congress has the authority to ratify trade treaties. A lot of folks forget that and look only towards the executive branch, which branch implements and executes the treaties. Now, in a sense, it seems like the executive branch actually enters into the treaties because they conduct foreign relations and they actually negotiate the trade arrangements. But it is important to remember that Congress, at the end of the day, has the exclusive authority to ratify these trade treaties. Next slide. There is a foundational food trade agreement, and this is called GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade of 1947. This is the granddaddy, if you will. It sets up the multilateral trading system through rules. Its purpose is to reduce trade barriers. In other words, free trade. That's the entire predicate for this trading system, is to engage in free trade. Now, there are a number of countries that belong to GATT, this massive organization, and it has developed through these sets of rules what we refer to as an international food system, and through a series of trade negotiations, so-called, and these are called rounds, which refers actually to the meeting locale. So, for example, there was the Uruguay round, which was a very, very important round of GATT. It was launched in 1986. And this round was responsible for setting up the World Trade Organization, also known as the WTO, in 1994. So the WTO became the successor of GATT. That's a misprint or a mistake on the slide, not the WTO. And it assumed control of this multilateral trading system. And so the rules that are in play here for the WTO are the GATT rules that are still effective and the new WTO rules that set up rules to help handle trade and, most importantly, disputes. Next slide, please. So there are other trade agreements, just by way of reference. So we understand this is a very kind of complicated, interesting area. And these were all formulated during the Uruguay round. There's the Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, also known as the SPS, Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, TBT, Agreement on Agriculture, known as AA, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. These are all different from one another, and there's other agreements as well. These are some of the major agreements, but they all intersect and work together to create this sort of world apparatus, if you will, on the regulation of food and agriculture. Next slide, please. Within this system, disputes arise, and it really shouldn't be any surprise, as there are different ways of looking at food, food safety, food culture, and what we eat. Now, these disputes arise, and they are then governed by these agreements, these treaties, which are legal instruments. So, for example, under the SPS instrument or treaty, we have a barrier, or an exception to a trade barrier exception to Article what's called 20B. And this exception allows countries to put barriers in place, or these barriers are known as SPS measures. They protect human, animal, and plant health. And they have led to a number of really interesting disputes. And this is important to our conversation today, so bear with me. I'll just touch on these very, very briefly. For example, between the US and the EU, we've had disputes over beef hormones, GMOs. And these disputes actually were set in place because of laws that were passed in the EU that restricted trade of US goods into the EU in these two areas on the grounds that the EU was protecting human health. Now, without getting into the details of these disputes, we should note that there was a principle at play here that divided the EU from the US called the precautionary principle. And these disputes took many, many years to resolve, and literally thousands of pages of written opinion by dispute panels or by the appellate boards for the WTO. These were major, major disputes that had divided the EU from the US over food policy. With respect to the TBT agreement, and this applies to what we call non-safety attributes or information, there was one major dispute that I'm sure we are all familiar with that involved what's called COOL, or mandatory country of origin labeling. And in this particular case, the US actually lost. In the above cases, under the SPS, the US actually prevailed. And the COOL was a case that involved a number of different countries that filed a complaint against the US's mandatory country of origin labeling on meat products that was passed under a law by Congress. And it ended up with the withdrawal of the US from the COOL program or mandatory labeling. The point being that these are major dispute resolutions that have taken effect under this very complicated and interesting food trade system that we have in place. Next slide, please. Now, something's happened to this multilateral trade system. That something is the Doha Round, which commenced in 2001 and has essentially been pronounced dead, which it is, in fact. And in many ways, that has led to predicted demise of this entire multilateral trade system, or at least stoppage of its growth. Now, there are consequences, and the debate over the Doha Round really relates to ag subsidies and a number of other issues as it relates to food, as well as additional non-food issues. But ag subsidies was a major part of the failure of the Doha Round. Now, the consequences of the dead Doha Round are quite profound and have led to NAFTA and other bilateral and regional free trade agreements, because countries such as the US and other countries are seeking these as an alternative to the WTO trade agreements. The multilateral trade agreement regime has been seen as unwieldy. There's so many disputes, so many fractions, as developing countries, I believe, are discovering leverage that they otherwise did not have earlier, and we've reached an impasse. As a result, free trade is now being transferred to these bilateral trade agreements as an alternative. Next slide, please. So these regional and bilateral trade agreements, excuse me for just 1 minute, my screen just went dead. Now I'm back on. One of which is a very important agreement, and that's NAFTA. And this is known as a regional free trade agreement because it pertains to three countries, or the three-legged stool, so to speak, that Alyshia referred to, speaking of US, Canada, and Mexico. Now, there are some distinct benefits to these agreements, which is why they're attracting countries like the US and other countries. And I should mention, China, for example, has entered into a number of trade agreements with countries all around the world, and it's been very active in this area. But they're quicker. You can reach an agreement more quickly. They're a way of resolving continuing WTO trade disputes. For example, the Korean-US trade agreement was able to to overcome Korea's ban on beef hormones. I was speaking in China many years ago, and I recall while traveling there was a massive demonstration in the streets of Korea over the importation of beef from the U.S. Well, there is now importation of beef from the U.S. into China, excuse me, into Korea from the U.S. Due to KORUS, the Korean Free Trade Agreement. This is a way of resolving that dispute. It also is a way to create alliances on trade issues, which becomes an important strategic point. So these bilateral regional trade agreements are very appealing to countries such as the U.S. and Mexico and Korea. Just as a way of to kind of fill in the edges here, other regional trade agreements include the Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as TPP, which has gained quite a bit of attention in the media, as well as the TTIP, which did not conclude, and that's the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which between the U.S. and Europe, which was, by the way, very, very contentious in the food sector, from GMOs, organic food, animal welfare, beef hormones, antibiotics, geographical indications, the list continues. These are issues that, again, create a major point of conflict between the EU and the U.S., and over time, it will be left to be seen as to whether or not this agreement eventuates. Okay, so what are the considerations? Let's sit back now that we've gone through this refresher course and look at what I call the unintended consequences of NAFTA that Alyshia has just gone over in a very thorough and complete manner. In short, it's introduced a Western diet, which has introduced dietary diseases on a level that we really haven't seen before in another country. Although all countries are experiencing it, Mexico, for sure has this problem is punctuated, and many believe is due to the likes of NAFTA. So that's one unintended consequence. That's quite an important consequence. Another consideration is that these agreements are being viewed increasingly as a tool to implement U.S. domestic food policies on a region. So, for example, labeling, front-of-pack labeling or warning labels, which is something that's been being developed in many countries in South America, but particularly in Canada. Front-of-pack, of course, is a label that condenses nutrition information to symbols or to information that can be readily observed by the consumer on the front of a label or of a consumer product, a food product, that enables them to understand a nutrition profile at a quick glance. These can be very controversial for food companies who don't like the information that's being portrayed on the label. And so this is a really interesting battle that now looms. The taxation, especially with sugar-sweet beverages, is another tool, or is another tool that's being used by Mexico, for example, that has been opposed by the likes of Coca-Cola and other beverage companies, in something that the U.S., at least segments of the U.S. food industry oppose. A lot of this is done under the rubric of science, and we could spend a lot of time talking about science and nutrition and politics, but without having necessarily a desire to go there because of the interest of time, I'll just mention that for what it's worth. Now, the Trump administration and NAFTA, it's been interesting to view what's happening with respect to the U.S. policies through a New York Times report that was in March of 2018 titled "In NAFTA Talks, U.S. Tries to Limit Junk Food Warning Labels." And this was a report in the New York Times where the report was that the U.S. is going to attempt to use NAFTA to leverage against some of these more progressive tools that are being used by Canada and Mexico to give additional information to consumers with respect to labeling, or to try to alter behavior of consumers by steering them away from sugar-sweetened beverages. Now,
Michael, I missed
yes.
I'm listening, so I missed a 2-minute warning, but I'll give it to you now.
Okay, thank you. So my prediction is that you're going to see this same sort of strategy implemented elsewhere. And it should be noted that the early negotiations or early talks between the US and the UK, for example, once Brexit occurs, if it ever does occur, in the UK, that these sort of same sort of trade issues are going to arise in those trade negotiations. Now, I want to make the final point here in my remaining time. Next slide, please. With respect to the implications and what to do. Let me just throw out 3 sort of large concepts that we can think about here. One is the sort of cultural implications, and I think Alyshia has spoken to this. It's interesting how trade discounts culture. There's a lot of argument that trade homogenizes societies. It creates carryover problems and benefits from one society to another. Another area of thought or concept is focused on human rights, and I know this is something that Daria is going to talk about. We frame the discussion about what's going on in Mexico and the consequences or unintended consequences of these trade agreements in terms of human rights and the right to choose and the right to sovereignty and the right to food, which has a lot of different implications. The last one that I want to just throw out is something that I've been giving a lot of thought to, and I think it's an interesting way of looking at especially trade and the unintended consequences. Trade is essentially an economic enterprise, and one could argue, I think, that by framing these unintended consequences into an economic argument, we've got something quite powerful. What Alyshia has referred to has a lot of economic cost in terms of especially health cost in Mexico, which has led to the tax really on sugar-sweetened beverages. Without abating at all the growth of obesity and dietary diseases, you've got a tremendous price tag for countries in terms of health, and also I would add even national security. It's becoming increasingly difficult to have an army of fit young people that are physically fit and able to engage in their responsibilities, and so these costs are enormous. And I think if we change the paradigm of food and look at it as medicine, which is something that Tufts University is now attempting to do, and look at food as a prescription towards really creating a country's national interest in terms of not just social and not just culture and health implications, but also look at it in terms of the economic consequences. I think that's an interesting way to look at trade, because trade really is an economic activity. And if we're creating huge economic consequences by shifting a Western diet into a country like Mexico, which arguably NAFTA has done, then we've created a real issue that comes at this problem, I think, from a different direction and may resonate with policymakers in a way that is different and new. For example, we've seen insurance companies and large corporations in the U.S. now paying much more attention to diets in the workplace because of the cost. So I think this is something interesting, and it's something to think about as we move along these bilateral and regional trade agreements, including NAFTA. Thank you.
That's an excellent, money talks, Michael. So that's a great way to approach, I think, is the economics. And thank you for your presentation. Very
Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah. And so, as Michael mentioned, next we have Daria Kortova from Russia, Moscow, Russia, and she is going to talk with us about the human rights aspect of the impact of NAFTA and the right to food.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, for giving me this opportunity. I'm a beginning scholar, so it's really important for me to share thoughts with more experienced colleagues, to get some critique and to get some insight. And I'm not sure if I have the controls.
You should have.
Seems like it's down. Let me just.
Yep, you have the control.
Yeah, but it seems like.
No.
Oh, okay.
You're going crazy.
Oh my God. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about human rights in the NAFTA agreement, and I actually used the new name for this agreement, the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. And oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? So what follows is not something, is not an academic kind of discussion. It's not very much theoretical. It's just the description of my brief considerations of how U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement works in terms of human rights and also ethics, because I'm really interested in how ethics, especially bioethics and food ethics, can influence law regulation and how it can influence the normative content of law that we have now, and how it can change the whole way our food policy and our policy concerning, medical research, biotechnologies is structured. And so, if you look at this slide, you see that there is a note in the bottom. So while listening to me, please think about the following question. Just think if you have some thoughts on it or not. So is the world really beginning to wake up and listen? And it might seem a bit vague. I mean, the question itself might seem a bit vague, but as we will be going through my presentation, you might start to understand what I tried to express with this question. So the main framework of my analysis of this new agreement was based on the two main rights, human rights, that are expressed in many human rights, international law human rights instruments. Some of them binding, some of them non-binding. Most important binding instrument is the International Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, 1966, where both of these rights are mentioned. So the right to food is the right to have access to nutritious, healthy, and safe food. It also includes the right to be fed, and the right to health includes the right to the highest attainable standards of health. It embraces health facilities, it embraces mental health, and anything that can benefit our physical and mental health. And I have this diagram that shows that these rights have an intersection, because as the UN human rights bodies have numerously mentioned, all human rights are interconnected, and there can't be right to food without right to health, and vice versa. There can't be right to health without access to healthy, safe, and nutritious food. So when I was looking at the NAFTA agreement, I just chose 3 chapters for my analysis, simply because they have the biggest interest for me personally. And these are chapters on agriculture, on environment, and a short chapter on investment. And so when I was going through the agricultural chapter, this is chapter 3 of the agreement. Overall, to me, it provided kind of a sad impression, because it always talks about all these, pure technicalities of international trade, like tariffs and subsidies and dispute resolution and what to do in case you have you know, your partner in NAFTA trying to impose a subsidy to help its domestic provider and things like this. But it really glosses over really sizable and sensitive problems of modern agriculture and of modern urban agriculture and rural agriculture, and all the things that we discuss in academia, all the things that human rights and agricultural and development activists are concerned about. For example, it doesn't even talk about sustainability. This chapter literally does not mention the word sustainable development or just sustainability or sustainable as an adjective. And sustainability has become a real buzzword for everyone who is interested in food policy and agricultural development, but the agreement does not make any notion of it, at least in this agricultural chapter. It talks about providing development, and it even touches the rural development in Article 3.7 to E, but it just talks about the Committee on Agriculture within the NAFTA framework that should foster cooperation between the state members of the agreement in terms of this development and rural development problems. But first of all, it does not explain what fostering cooperation means. I mean, it does not mean that within NAFTA there can be a conflict when, for example, Mexico blames the United States for not supporting their own local farmers. According to this agreement, this is just not possible. It's a hypothetical situation that might not happen at all, but it's just an example. The second thing is that even though this chapter mentions development, it does not give the definition of what development is in the eyes of the drafters and the participants of this agreement, because development can be viewed from different theoretical standpoints, and while it can be viewed from a humanitarian viewpoint of development as giving the capability to human beings to achieve all the development goals that they want to achieve, to have their kids educated, to have their local farm flourish, and things like this. It can also be viewed from the classical neoliberal point of view, which just thinks that development means providing more and more processed foods and industrialization. Another thing that really, I would say, frustrated me was the regulation of agricultural biotech. The regulation of the trade in agricultural biotechnologies is also included in this chapter 3 of the agreement, but it's not hard at all. So it's very short. There's a very short sub-chapter in this, and it doesn't touch a very important question. It doesn't touch the regulation of biotech in agriculture in terms of anti-competition practices. And we all know the names of global ag biotech giants that are now dominating the markets in the United States, in Europe, and even in Russia now, in the light of the Bayer-Monsanto deal that has been partly approved by the Russian anti-competition authority. And it's just my opinion, my personal opinion, that I think that if we really want to end this domination of not so good biotech companies, we really need to regulate them harder and stricter in terms of anti-competition practices. And you might have heard a couple of days ago about this scandal that the EU Parliament finally realized that the Monsanto report on the safety of its glyphosate pesticide has been just copy-pasted from Monsanto's funded research. So this is why biotech should be regulated really harder than it is now, according to NAFTA, according to the EU regulations, and according even to regulations that I have in my country. So the next chapter that I decided to take a look at is voted on to environment. It's chapter 24, and it's really almost perfect as to content and the trendiness of subjects that it tries to include. This chapter really talks about everything starting from sustainability and how it is important to our welfare, to consumer protection, to providing information to consumers about possible harms and hazards from industries and trade, and it also manages corporate social responsibility. So in terms of content, this chapter is really perfectly drafted, and it's very modern and contemporary. It really has a powerful and feasible point. It's Article 24.6 that offers a mechanism for any individual within the state members of NAFTA to turn to their own local authorities that have connections to NAFTA framework in case they think that there should be an investigation launched into environmental harm made by any trade activities within the framework of NAFTA. This is a really feasible track of human rights protection, and if it's going to work, that would be a really important step forward for human rights protection in all of the free member states. But what I was really concerned of when I was going through this chapter was the language. And when we talk about international agreements, language means everything, because it expresses the true nature of the state obligations that are enshrined in an agreement. And this chapter, on chapter 24 of the NAFTA agreement, uses the verb to recognize, for example, when it talks about the importance of corporate social responsibility for sustainable development, and it just states that member states do recognize the importance of the CSR for sustainability. But as someone who knows public international law on a quite decent level, I would ask, what do you mean by recognition? Because it's not, to me, it seems like it's not a binding normative obligation. It's not a hard obligation. It's just, it has a very declaratory nature, and as such, it does not really change. It might not really change the attitude to CSR and sustainable development or sustainability in the member states, in NAFTA member states. A very short look at chapter 14 about the investment and investment activities within NAFTA, and I called it infamous investment, because we all know that we all know of cases when investors come to country, especially when it's a developing country or even so-called underdeveloped country, and drains off the resources from the country. It takes the land from people, it resettles people, and the country's land, the country's forests, the country's natural resources are just drained off by the actions of, by the acts of these Western influential investors who have money on their side. So at least this chapter leaves the state with the right to apply measures to protect human health, animal health, and lives. It's Article 14 and 16, but there is a question how often involuntarily these will be applied, because we all can imagine cases where an investor comes with lots of money and just no one is interested in protecting animal life, for example, or animal health when the country has oops. Yes, Susan, I think 5 minutes will be more than enough. So yeah, so will Mexico or United States or Canada be ready to trade money for animal health? Okay, so let me jump to my overall impression on the, Okay, let me jump to the overall impression from the human rights language and human rights content of the new NAFTA agreement. I read the preamble of the agreement and then I compared it to the main body of the agreement, and I thought, but wait, you've put really good stuff into the preamble. Sustainability, protection of human rights, protection of vulnerable persons, protection of indigenous communities, but where do you really reflect these in the body text? It also leads me to the second point. The language of human rights requires more normativity. For example, the right to food has its own obligatory normative framework to protect to promote and to protect, respect, and to promote. But I'm not really sure that we have to expect this from a trade agreement, at least now, because the overall level of development of international law in these areas is not satisfactory as well. Another thing is really good. What is really good is that human rights protection can be reinforced indirectly. For example, through greater consumer protection, through harder rules on vulnerable sectors such as trade and pharmaceuticals. The NAFTA agreement is kind of successful here, and probably what we now see as non-normative expression of a state position can later crystallize into something harder, into hard law, into normative language. I also tried to touch just a little, and I hope I have like a minute left. I tried to touch the ethical content of the agreement, because to me it's really important, and I think that ethics can be a very powerful tool to change the society. And actually the NAFTA has a couple of articles that can be where ethics can be found, and it has, for example, articles 24.14 where the parties recognize the importance of voluntary sharing of information, voluntary partnerships that enforce the environmental protection, enforce the just cut the way towards sustainability. But it also has this remark that these should not create unnecessary barriers to trade, and this is highly political, in my opinion. I mean, you can just blame a partnership that appeals to ethics and to ethical consumption as you can blame it in creating an unnecessary barrier to trade, and that's a political instrument. So I'm heading towards the end, and I really want you to think once again: is the world really beginning? I'm sorry, there's a grammar mistake. I forgot to correct it. Is the world now beginning to understand, to act awkwardly, to admit its mistakes, or are we just standing still and still doing nothing to improve what we can improve? Well, thank you, and sorry for being over my time.
No problem with that. Seems like...
Sorry.
Oh.
I think it's fine. It was the end.
Yeah. Here. Okay. Good. So thank you very much, Daria, for that contribution to the discussion. Very interesting. And so now I would like to just ask if anybody has questions or wants to follow up, or anybody in the panel wants to engage. Usually what I find in these panel presentations is that the panelists engage with each other on different things that they want to follow up. But we're close to time one. We've got a couple of minutes here. I am fine with continuing the conversation. It will be uploaded to YouTube, and so we can spend a few more minutes talking if there are issues that you're interested in discussing.
It looks like there was a question posted during Michael's presentation by Steve Suppin. I don't know if you can see it in the chat.
I can't see it, I think.
I don't see it.
I can read it.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, he says, could you talk about NAFTA investment dispute over high fructose corn syrup and the new NAFTA rules on food labeling?
Yeah, I don't, first of all, I should say hi to Steve. I know Steve. Leave it to Steve to ask a really difficult question. What was the question again?
Could you talk about NAFTA investment dispute over high fructose corn syrup and the new NAFTA rules on food labeling?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can answer the question as precisely as Steve has asked the question, except to say that certainly high fructose corn syrup is the nub of the problem, or the issue with respect to the U.S. and Mexico. and I don't really have a clear view as to NAFTA and its effect on labeling rules moving forward. I guess I would turn the question around and ask Steve if he has information that's more current.
Yeah, I was going to say, Steve, if you want to unmute yourself, you're certainly welcome to jump in here. Steve was a participant on our very first panel, also on NAFTA. And Steve is with the IATP. Steve?
Yeah, I can
speak
briefly to the issue. The dispute on high fructose corn syrup, which was initiated by Archer Daniels Midland, Tate Lyle, and another producer of high fructose corn syrup, was carried out under the investor state dispute settlement agreement. And these private arbitration panels usually rule in favor of the plaintiff, and governments either have to change their laws and or pay a monetary payment where the panel decides that XYZ rule or judicial judgment or law has impacted the anticipated profits of the investment that the plaintiff has made in under a trade agreement. So under the and obviously the flood of high fructose corn syrup, especially as it's used in soft drinks and in junk food, certainly have very important impact on Mexican public health, chronic diet-related diseases. Under the new NAFTA rules, the investor state dispute settlement mechanism is reduced. Assuming that the new NAFTA is approved, it is reduced to application in the fossil fuel industry, mining, and one other industry that I can't name. So it's not clear to me whether Mexico will go ahead and reissue its rules on high fructose corn syrup, which were tax-oriented rules. So that's a bit of good news, but the news on food labeling is definitely bad news, because a prohibition on front of the pack food labeling would not only be inconsistent with what the European Union is practicing in food labeling, but it's arguably inconsistent with the WTO labeling rules and the technical barriers to trade agreement. So there's some reason to be optimistic about investor dispute settlement in the new NAFTA, and to be very pessimistic about the future of food labeling under a new NAFTA.
Mm-hmm. And that brings up a really good point about what we've been talking about. The agreement is not signed. I don't think it's been ratified by any of the three countries. I understand in Mexico it's just more or less a rubber stamp. If the president says go, it's go. But it hasn't been ratified or signed off approved by Congress. So is there a practical way to influence any additional negotiations, or is there something that consumers, academics, thought leaders can do to?
This is Michael. And thank you, Steve, for the clarification. And I now that I've heard you ask the question, I understand where you're coming from. I thought the answer to your question, Susan, specifically is really no. One of the problems with trade negotiations is that they are really buttoned up. Academics and policy wonks and others can certainly express opinion, and they may be listened to, but this is not an open forum where people can come in and state opinion and engage in the discussions. It really, much of this is done behind closed doors, and it can be very frustrating. at times. And you can see why they would do it. I mean, you don't want to open up trade negotiations for every NGO and academic in the world, because then you're never going to get moving. But it is difficult to really weigh in a way that you can tell you're making a difference. That's why I keep coming back to the economic argument. I think that trade is all about economics and creating economic leverage, and certainly making the argument that front of pack labeling is a way to reduce health cost, in other words, and eliminating or at least reducing the consumption of sugar sweetened beverages is a way to reduce health costs. I think is a powerful, not that it's a more powerful argument than rights or culture, but it will resonate, I think, more with the same folks that are advocates of free trade.
Yes, thank you for that depressing thought. Alyshia, do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, I think it's just to add on what Michael was saying. I mean, I think there are practical reasons that make a lot of sense for why trade negotiations happen the way that they do. But I think the other layer of it is that there is an assumption that the vast majority of us don't particularly care, and that our eyes glaze over when we hear things about trade policy. I know mine did until I started to research and dig in and saw how much trade policy influences my day-to-day life and the day-to-day life of people that I care about. And I think that whatever we can do to make these issues more relevant and of interest to a larger segment of the population will bring sunshine into the dark corners in which these things are negotiated. And there will have to be greater accountability. There still may be deputized negotiators that hammer out the details behind closed doors, but I think unless most of us have a better a larger interest in what's going on behind those closed doors, there's really no pressure to do things in any sort of different way. And meanwhile, the corporations, of course, do get their interests heard and their wish lists heeded. And so I think that there's an imbalance there that is premised not only on the way fast track trade negotiation happens, but also just in terms of our willingness to cede decision making or even relevance of this issue to others. So that would be my 2 cents.
That's a great 2 cents, and you hit perfectly, Alyshia, on the question I always ask. Ultimately, how does this affect what's for lunch, what's on our plate, and what our available food choices are? And that is what is the critical point. Steve had a short comment that he wanted to add. Steve?
Yeah, so Michael's true. Under the Trade Promotion Authority Act, the public does not have the ability to influence, nor indeed does Congress have the ability to influence the actual terms of the agreement, only to change U.S. legislation to be consistent with the agreement. However, there are other ways to improve the negotiations process so that the public has much more influence in the final content of the agreement. I mean, this is not a private commercial agreement. This is an agreement that affects all manner of public interest. And so, the European Union has decided, under huge civil society pressure, that they're going to release the draft negotiations papers after every round of negotiations. So you can see how the agreement is developing, and through your elected representatives say, oh my God, they're gonna basically forbid financial reform regulation, or they're going to harmonize unregulated products in genetic engineering. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you could intervene after each round of negotiations, but unfortunately, unless Trade Promotion Authority is changed, then there will be no ability of Congress to actually exercise its constitutional duty.
Mm-hmm.
But during the rounds, there is ample opportunity if the U.S. Trade Representative would change its negotiating practices. There's nothing in the TPA that forbids the U.S. Trade Representative from releasing draft documents for comment to the public.
Right, but they don't.
That's their choice. It's also their choice to classify those documents under the military security classification system, which is really pretty crazy. Because
I agree that that's crazy, but also, like the whole issue we're talking about, food security, is becoming an issue, and it's also becoming an issue of national security. So it in my opinion, is all kind of mixed up. I want to thank you for your comments, Steve, and thank you, a big hearty thank you to all of our panelists for their contribution and participation here. It's been amazing, and as always, I learned a ton, and so much more to learn, so much more to do, and consumer awareness, I think, is a big part of the picture, as Alyshia pointed out. I hope you'll join us in February, third Thursday. What's for lunch in February is a new year, new food. How about cell-cultured meat? Will that be on your plate? So we'll talk about the regulatory landscape and what the safety environmental issues are, if they're being properly addressed. Possibly touching on export to Mexico and Canada, although I might save that for the one after this. And then, the harmonization of international regulations. There's always, as you can tell from these panels, there's always so much to talk about and so much to unpack here, and very important issues that are being addressed. And thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.